In today's game, Capablanca actually played one of his good friends in a simul, but even though he had lots of opponents at once, he still produced this small masterpiece. He played in his usual clear-cut style, not making the game too complicated, but once his opponent made a mistake, he just pounced immediately and won seemingly without any effort. He played Walter Shipley, as I said, a friend of his. Capablanca had white and opened with e4, e6, and after d4, d5 we have the French defense, which wasn't a surprise for Capablanca since Shipley specialized in the French. White can play this in a number of ways, but Capablanca chose knight to c3, inviting a winnower with bishop to b4, but Shipley declined and played knight to f6, although after bishop to g5, Black decided to play bishop b4 now anyway. This is the so-called McCutcheon variation, which can also get pretty sharp. So Black basically ignores White's threat. White was threatening e4, e5 since the knight is pinned. Capablanca could have gone e5. Then Black would counterattack the bishop with h6. Now White has a number of moves, but bishop d2 is the most common. And after bishop takes, pawn takes, and knight e4, the game can still get messy after queen to g4, which has some similarities with the winnower, and I can imagine Capablanca just wasn't interested in these complications. So going back to the game, Capablanca instead took on d5, Shipley recaptured with the queen, remember the knight is pinned, and again Capablanca is happy to simplify the game some more. He took on f6, and after bishop takes c3, b takes, and g takes f6, both sides have structural damage to their pawn structure, although both kings are for the moment relatively safe. But White isn't better developed even though he had the first move, so with that in mind, Black can be pretty satisfied with the opening. It continued queen d2 and c5, putting pressure on White's center pawn before getting his knight out. As Shipley said after the game that he already played this once before against Capablanca and that they drew, so he saw no reason not to repeat it. Capablanca got his knight out, as did Black, again putting pressure on d4, and now Capablanca deviates from his earlier game with Shipley. In that game he played queen to f4, but in this game he went queen to e3, so he may take on c5 next, therefore c takes d4, and after c takes d4, bishop to d7 by Shipley, preparing to castle on the queen side. Capablanca also prepared to castle, but Shipley didn't allow that, he checked. Capablanca could have blocked the check, but he kept his king in the middle of the board. He went king to e2, because he believes they'll soon go into an endgame, and then the king is simply good on e2. Black castled, rook from h2 b1, just claiming the semi-open file. And now Black could play knight to e7 and then put the bishop on c6, where it's active but also defending the king. Shipley instead played e5, which is not a bad move per se, but since he's playing Capablanca I don't like that move, because Capablanca excels in simplified positions where he can use his great technique. And now the game will be simplified quite a lot. First, d takes e5, and after knight takes, queen takes, and f takes e5, all of a sudden we're in an endgame and Capablanca still has a little initiative because he can double rooks on the b file and target the b pawn, and he can also put the bishop on e4 to target that point again, and for now Black can only react. Bishop to e4 was indeed played, and Black has to do something about the b pawn, and both options aren't really attractive. In the game, Black played bishop to c6, going b6 maybe was the better choice, but after a4, White does get very easy play with this minority attack, and probably Shipley just didn't like that. So he went bishop to c6, but of course the downside is that after this trade, Black has two isolated pawns, which will be easier to target for Capablanca. In fact, Capablanca gets ready to attack Black's pawns. He plays rook to b3, planning to double rooks and go rook to b7, and already Black can get a lost position if he's careless. Let's say Black tries rook to d7 to cover the 7th rank, then Black is already losing. First, rook from a to b1, threatening a check and winning the rook in the corner, so rook from h to d8, but then first, rook b8 check, king to c7, and rook from 1 to b7 check. King d6 is then the only move, and then white just trades on d8 and takes on f7. White threatens to win a second pawn now, but even if black stops that by trading rooks, then white has an easily winning king and pawn endgame. White can get a passed pawn on the king side, and black only has weaknesses. Black's best is actually rook to d5, and the plan is after rook from a to b1 to move the king over to e6. So first king d7, and after the check, king to e6. So white still gets a pawn, but after rook from h to d8, black controls the d-file and will at the very least get counterplay. Black's king is also safe enough, and it guards 2 pawns. But Shipley also didn't play that. Instead, king to c7 was played, but that doesn't work out. Now again, rook from a to b1, simply threatening a check on b7 and win a pawn. Now, if black would avoid the check with king to d6, then he still has to give up a pawn, because after rook to b7, black cannot cover the 7th rank with rook d7, because rook d1 check is a skewer and it's time to resign. So Shipley saw nothing better than trading off the rooks, but after everything's traded off, the black king has been dragged 1 square away from the center, and that's actually enough for Capablanca to win the game. And let's see how he did. First he brought the king to the center of the board, and after king to d6, the plan is to simply create a Zugzwang position. So he's going to make sure that black runs out of useful moves, and when he does, he can advance his king and start taking black's pawns. He first played g4, so that limits the mobility of the f and h pawns. Shipley shuffled the king over to e6, which at the very least keeps white's king out of f5. But now h4. Now let's say black would try h5, just as an example. Let's see how white would win then. First, g5. And now white will use his extra tempi to make black run out of moves. So after c5, c4, the c pawn is stopped. Then a6, a3, a5, and a4. So now the a pawn is stopped. And already you can see black barely has any moves. Of course, if the king moves, then the white king moves in, and already black is dropping the e pawn. So really, all black can do is move his f pawn, and whether he goes f6 or f5 doesn't really matter, because white just takes normally or en passant like this. And after the recapture, white has this extra move, f4. Black has to take the pawn, otherwise he just drops a pawn for nothing. But when he does, white has the opposition. And depending on where the black king goes, let's say king to g6, the white king moves in, takes the pawns, and white wins easily. So that's what could happen after h5. In the game, black tried f6, and white can play all kinds of pawn moves now. The point is that white has more possible pawn moves to make, so black will run out first. Capablanca went for f4. Now, this did not happen, but again, as an example, if h6, then black will run out of moves like this. First we trade on e5, then we create a passed pawn like this, so black's king can never go far away, and now black runs out of moves after c5, c4, a6, a3, a5, and a4. The black king has to move, so after, let's say, king to d6, king to f5 is played, white can simply promote the g-pawn, but even the e-pawn is hanging, and white wins. In the game, Shipley took the pawn, king takes, and h6. You can see that black can do nothing useful. Maybe white can even use the g6 square later on. I'm sure Shipley knew he was losing, but they continued a bit longer like this. Black now moved the king. It doesn't matter if he goes c5 first or not. After king to f5, he did play that anyway, but then simply c4, and Shipley resigned. There's just nothing left to do. If he'd gone king to f7, then h5. All the pawns are fixed, so the king has to move, and white infiltrates via e6. Now black has to leave the f-pawn. White takes it, and black cannot even hang on to the h-pawn. The white king just shoulders his nemesis out the way, and after king to g6, the h-pawn falls as well, and it's of course dead lost for black. So this is one of those Capablanca games where it just seems like it was inevitable that he would win. Black seemingly didn't do a whole lot wrong, they get an equal position, and all of a sudden it's just clear that Capablanca is completely winning. Let's briefly check some key positions. So the game started with this offbeat McCutcheon variation of the French, which can get very sharp. But instead of playing sharply, Black initiated this series of trades, which pretty much gave Capablanca exactly what he wanted, a simplified position with some initiative. But it was at this point that Shipley, I guess, miscalculated something, because instead of going rook to d5, he traded off all the rooks and his king ended up on the edge of the board in a king and pawn endgame. And then it was simply a matter of making Black run out of useful moves, which made sure Black would start losing pawns and eventually the game. So again, a very nice demonstration of Capablanca's excellent technique. Let me know in the comments if you have any favorite Capablanca games, and I may cover that one next. Please like the video if you enjoyed, and I'll be seeing you guys again soon, and take care.